This is the panel, Welcoming Churches, The Journey to Safer Spaces. I'm Peggy Campolo, and I'm an American Baptist. And everybody will just say that, and you can look in your books for the rest of what is about them.
I'm Obie Holmen. I'm an ELCA Lutheran, straight ally, and a historian of this movement.
I'm Ann Thompson-Cook, she, her, hers, identified with the reconciling movement in the United Methodists.
Leo Treadway, I'm a Lutheran, Wingspan Ministry, St. Paul Reformation Lutheran Church.
Hi, my name's Rosie Olmsted, and I can't remember what church I'm from. So please help me, somebody. United Church of Christ. I'm sorry, I've had a stroke, so that shows sometimes.
I'm Alan Harris, and I'm one of the co-founding directors of the Open and Affirming Ministries program of the what was then GLAD Alliance, now is Disciples LGBTQ+ Alliance, and a regional minister for the capital area of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
I'm Casey Lopata, a Catholic tradition with various groups, and I'll mention them when I talk later.
For those of you who were at the opening plenary this morning, you heard excellent stories of the early days of the context in which this welcoming church movement was born. With this beginning coming out individually in the churches in the early 1970s, late 60s and early 1970s, there were also the formation of advocacy groups. The Gay Methodist Coalition, and Steve Webster is here, who was one of the original founders of that. Gay Presbyterians, Lutherans concerned for gay and lesbian people, Episcopal Integrity. So there was these advocacy organizations that began and coming out, and they were making appearances at church conventions and so on. How did the denominations react? Not well. By the end of the decade, many of the denominations who previously had no policies, had no gay and lesbian policies, had no policies about gays and lesbians in their church, much less in their pulpits. But by the end of the 70s, they began passing resolutions or definitive guidance or whatever their denomination used. And I'm going to just read some of them. Methodist, we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this practice to be incompatible with Christian teaching. Two branches of Lutheranism at that time, before they merged a number of years later, the Lutheran Church in America. Homosexuality is viewed biblically as a departure from the heterosexual structure of God's creation. The American Lutheran Church. Homosexual erotic behavior was contrary to God's intent for his children. Presbyterian definitive guidance. Homosexuality is not God's wish for humanity. Unrepentant homosexual practice does not accord with the requirements for ordination. An Episcopal resolution. It is not appropriate for this church to ordain a practicing homosexual. So in response to this retrenchment of the various denominations, this negative reaction to the formation of the advocacy groups, negative reaction to this collective coming out of gay and lesbians within the church, the denominations went backwards. Dr. Louis Crew, who was the founder of Episcopal Integrity, called the late 70s the height of homophobia in the church. So as a consequence, these advocacy groups changed course to a certain extent. Instead of expecting to change denominational policy, they began the practice of seeking individual congregations. If we can't change the whole church, we'll try to do it one congregation at a time. In 1978, two New York City churches, West Park Presbyterian and Riverside Church, both came out as congregations that were going to be supportive. And the term that the West Park Presbyterian used was they were going to be a more like church. And in response to that, the Presbyterian advocacy group at their next convention said, well, we should try to do this. This should become our focus. And their more like statement read, we should try to identify more light congregations in which gay people will be welcomed without having to hide or deny their sexual orientation. So this is the context in which the various welcoming church movements began, often following the example of the more like Presbyterians.
So as I said, I'm Ann Thompson-Cook. I'm a cisgender, straight identified woman, obviously white. And I created a lot of the print resources that were used by the various denominational groups in the early days. So I wanted to talk about what it was like then. 40 years ago, what was the context for that? For the most part, LGBT people were very deeply closeted and often extremely isolated. If they were lucky, they found other people, such as the gay alliances that you've been talking about in the denominations, which, by the way, I saw as walking a very delicate line between the kind of advocacy that you're speaking of and supporting each other, for supporting those who were not able to be public and very isolated. And because just about everybody was hiding who they were, straight people, for the most part, didn't know that they knew gay people. So very few legal rights, lots of rounding people up, and violence toward queer people. The secular movement was also in its early days, and they were led by people who were quite averse to talking about religion. So even though they were doing very important work on gay rights, they weren't likely to connect with people who were clutching their Bibles. Transgender people were almost completely off the radar other than drag at that time. No mainstream coverage of LGBT people, at least nothing positive, as well as movies and TV that reinforced stereotypes such as that being queer was perverted, unseemly, not something you could talk about unless you talked about it negatively or with condemnation. Queer people were especially seen as a menace because they were out to recruit children to their lifestyle. I'm seeing a lot of people who were here 40 years ago, like, you know, in that period, that know this very well. And as with slavery previously, Bible passages were used as justification for discrimination in every walk of life. So coming back to the perspective of white people in the mid-1980s, just about the only ones who were motivated to learn were people whose adult children had come out to them. They would contact PFLAG. PFLAG would send them material that was wrapped in brown paper with no identifying information because the parents were closeted too. And they didn't care what something looked like because they were so hungry for information. So in a nutshell, what we had was highly closeted LGBTQ community, abundant negative stereotypes, discrimination and violence, straight people not knowing they knew gay people, a secular movement that was only talking about rights, religious people who were hung up on negative biblical passages, and no one talking about transgender. So here's why I created that context for you. It was a pretty daunting challenge for the gay and lesbian alliances to expand their movement. At first, there were already, as he said, a few congregations that had created safe and welcoming spaces, and they joined like the movement immediately. But then there were people like my congregation that was basically progressive, but what they were saying is, we don't have any gay people, why would we talk about this? So once they did talk about it, the ultimate sticking point was this. well, if we welcomed gay adults, wouldn't we be sending a message to our kids that it was okay to be gay? Yeah. So, you know, that was a lot to work with. So what began happening especially in the 80s and 90s, but even before, as Obie said, gay and lesbian people began sharing their lives and stories with straight people in families, in congregations, in the workplace, in schools where they had children. And gradually people like Ellen DeGeneres came forward and the climate was changing in the entertainment landscape. And I personally think that at least for white people, going from invisible to visible has been the single biggest factor in the changes that have happened over the last 40 years, that whether it was in churches or in the community. So my own congregation underwent study and dialogue for several months and ended up voting unanimously to join the reconciling program. And I remember people coming to me and saying, should I come to your church? And I would say, well, the church voted. They have a strong intention to be welcoming, and they have no idea what that means, and there are some rough spots. So if you're up for coming and helping the congregation live into this, into their serious intention, you know, great. And if you're not up for it, why don't you wait a few years while we do that work? And a lot of people showed up, and I was telling somebody earlier, the congregation, I was the visible lead in the dialogue process, and so you would think that if somebody was going to talk about the reconciling folk, like I would be one, but no, that there became this euphemism for the gay people, the new gay people that were coming to our congregation, as they were the reconciling folk. And what were so you would hear in church council, well, what do the reconciling folk think about this? I mean, it was the old days. So after that, most of my contributions in leadership were, as I said, were developing materials. I was doing trainings in churches around the country. I was co-editing Open Hands, which was the ecumenical magazine serving the movement, serving on the early reconciling board. But most importantly, I was creating entry-level resources. I brought for show and tell, but they're still in my bag, so I'll get them out and you can see them later. The first one I did was And God Loves Each One, and most of the denominational groups, nobody had the kind of resources we needed to organize in congregations and to bring straight people along. Have you been giving me time and I haven't seen them this whole time?
Yes.
Okay. So I will just tell you one other thing that I co-founded. I developed these resources on sexual orientation and gender and how to talk to kids, and then developed a Black church organization, Many Voices, with Reverend Cedric Harmon. So I can talk about that more with the in the question and answer if anybody's interested in hearing more about those.
Thank you. I'm tempted to just skip what I was going to say and listen to the rest of what you had to say. My name is Leo Treadway. I founded the Wingspan Ministry at St. Paul Reformation Lutheran Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is also the the North American headquarters for Lutherans Concerned, now Reconciling Works. And together, we worked very closely on a number of goals. I should comment as to why I'm going to be speaking so much about Minnesota, and that is because in that state, we are so dense with Lutherans that you could throw a rock in any direction and hit one, and in some of the early days I was really tempted to do that.
Excuse me, Leo. It's also said that the Lutherans are more dense in Minnesota.
Okay, now I have to turn this over. That's true. Reconciling Works and Wingspan Ministry had two broad areas of goals. One was to create safe, secure, supportive space for GLBT people. For Lutherans concerned, that initially was chapters. The reconciling program came a little bit later in 1982. Wingspan was also involved in that. But together, we also had a second goal, which was to work inside the church and bring change within the church, and to work outside of the church with other GLBT colleagues and bring about change there. Now, it's important to recognize that whatever it was we were doing, and I can go into more detail with that later if you're interested, we were not doing this in a vacuum. There were some negative, largely negative, but some positive currents that were happening in our general society that I wanted to comment on. In the late 70s, Anita Bryant had her campaign to save our children, which targeted St. Paul as one of the cities to reverse the human rights protection. Jerry Falwell was going around the country, also visited Minneapolis to recruit people to stand against anything that GLBT people might be up to, literally anything. But in addition to that, the AIDS crisis hit us very hard, and along with that was a growing incidence of violence against gay men, including a number of very publicized murders. For lesbians, it seemed to take the form of lesbian mothers having their children taken away from them. So there were negative things which were happening that made the rationale for why there needed to be safe space very critical. At the same time, there were some positive things happening. The Minnesota Council of Churches passed a statement on ministry with gay and lesbian people, which created an incredible firestorm of media attention and more letters than the Minnesota Council of Churches had ever gotten in its entire history. Some for, some against. At that point, homosexuality was no longer that which would not speak its name. It was sort of the issue that just wouldn't shut up, no matter how you felt about it. Finally, I think the emergence of three groups of people really helped to change the complexion of welcoming conversations. The first of these was PFLAG, that you referenced. The second was a spouses group, both of which we welcome to provide space for at St. Paul Reformation. And the third were gay and lesbian youth, who apparently had not been invented until sometime in the 80s. But the point here was that leaders in the church and civic and political leaders might not feel they had to pay attention to me because, after all, I was only a homosexual. But by God, they had to pay attention to parents who were leaders in their congregations, who were contributors to their campaigns, and so forth and so on. And I think that when GLBT youth emerged, it suddenly took on a whole different feel, because suddenly the stories that we had told about what life was like for us was something that particularly PFLAG wanted to avoid for the current generation of GLBT kids. One of the areas we were to cover was in becoming a welcoming church, that make it easier to become more welcoming to other groups. In some cases, welcoming churches that had welcomed other minority groups, such as St. Paul Reformation had, becoming a reconciling congregation was kind of a no-brainer. But for other churches, taking the step to say that GLBT people were welcome here, their families were welcome here, sent a really strong message throughout the rest of our Lutheran churches, and because of Minnesota's preponderance of Lutherans elsewhere in the nation, that being a safe space, being a welcoming space, and particularly with LGBT people, was a signal that you two were welcome. We had a sharp spike in attendance and membership at St. Paul Reformation of interracial couples, primarily because they did not feel welcome in white churches or black churches, yet we welcome queers, and so there must be a place for them too. And I got the 2-minute warning, so I could drone on forever, but I'm not going to do that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rosie. Let's talk about hate. I believe that hate is a catalyst to move us into new directions. Even though Church of the Covenant, my church, had gays and lesbians already within its congregation, at that time, no one had contracted AIDS. When men with AIDS started coming into our congregation, we knew that we needed to make a decision. We needed to be part of the movement. We needed to open our hearts and become one with our new friends. And that decision, among others, led us to become open and affirming. The congregation knew that it truly wanted to be part of the journey for leading from hate to being truly, truly, truly open. And we had a lot of friends at that time. Sam Lolliger, who started the ONA work in the UCC congregation, Ann Day, which many of you know, and her partner Donna Enberg, who created the ONA process and resources for churches all over the country. Eleanor and Oliver Powell, who co-founded the UCC Parents of Lesbians and Gays. The journey from hate to love is hard, trying, painful, and in order for us to learn, we had to risk being uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. But what happened was that God helped us break through to make our hearts soft, to make our love real, to make our consciousness more present than we had ever known before. I want to end with a story. At an AIDS Action, do people know what AIDS Action is, or do people know what AIDS Action is? AIDS Action did a healing event at Church of the Covenant. Mick Comstock, who was one of our pastors at that time, told the people gathered there that we wanted them to participate in our church, to journey with us. And so the very next Sunday, during celebrations and concerns, Kevin and Joey came out as having AIDS and told us that they were going to die. Now the congregation wrapped their arms and their hearts around them, and the journey continued day by day for about 2 years, with meals and visits and prayers and tears and hugs for 2 years. That is how love overcomes hate. That is how we are church together. The Church of the Covenant, made that journey with 11 other men. So now, wherever you are in this room, I want you to take your arms around someone and hug them, please. Hug one another. And now, let's talk about love. God's love. We can stop talking about hate. Let's talk about love. Thank you.
Again, Alan Harris with the Open and Affirming Ministries program of Glad Alliance and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. So many of our programs had so many parallels that I don't think I need to go into the minutiae of that or the history. What I'd like to do is I'd like to pull out two things that are unique in the learnings from those, and one thing that is extraordinarily common that I think all of us would agree upon that we just have to keep naming. So, one of the unique things about the Christian Church Disciples of Christ is that we are in ecumenical partnership with the United Church of Christ. And when our program began to form and coalesce in the late 80s, when Glad Alliance oftentimes would look to its older, more knowledgeable partner, the United Church of Christ, which had resources and even a General Synod resolution to do that. And when we created the Open and Affirming program in about 1987, Reverend Lori Riddell was co-developer with me, and we knew instinctively that we should turn to the coalition, which it was called at the time, and learn from them. And as a matter of fact, our denominations were in ecumenical partnership talking about possible merger. And so we felt like, the disciples have a motto, Christian unity is our polar star, that we ought to parallel our organizations so that when we merged eventually, which did not happen, that we would be ready and ripe. While we did not merge, we did end up learning a lot, I think, from each other, and a lot of our congregations that are ecumenical parishes were able then to work kind of well together. And I will say, just on a humorous note, we even made a name. We could have gone with Reconciling Congregations or one of the other, but we wanted to match our UCC sisters and brothers, and they had Open and Affirming with the shortened ONA. So we thought it was kind of cute to be Open and Affirming O_A, just so that there was a little difference and a little similarity. But I think what I'd like to bring out of that is for our new generations of folk who are trying to work in this movement is really we have to be in partnership. We have to have coalitions. We have to learn from one another. I think we're in an age where identity politics is calling us to be, only Lutherans or only Episcopalians or only, and that's ridiculous. So I think that's why this conference is so important, is because we need to take this conference and then move dramatically forward on the way that we partner with one another, because the challenges are too great for us to try and do it alone. So that would be my learning from that. So the second kind of unique thing with the Disciples of Christ is we were kind of moving along, happy-go-lucky, slow, but sure, until 1991. And in 1991, something happened that transformed our whole movement. Dr. Michael Kinnaman was nominated to be the new general minister and president. And what came out, a conservative group, and I'm not even sure exactly how they figured this out, learned that he and his wife had paid $40, really kind of just as de rigueur, to become members of Glad Alliance. Well, they were then, affirming homosexuality. And Michael went on a tour around the denomination with gut-wrenching. He would later describe some of these meet and greets, some of these discussion groups that were horrific, where he was treated horribly. But anyway, so that General Assembly of all places in the Bible Belt, the buckle of the Bible Belt, Tulsa, Oklahoma, was a pretty traumatic experience for not just those who were affirming of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender persons, not just for us, but also for anyone on the spectrum of social justice. People of color, people who are committed to Disciples Peace Fellowship, because he ended up losing by less than 1% of the vote. And even more traumatic, we watched busloads of congregations come in because we have a polity that every congregation gets 2 votes automatically. And by the end of that day, we didn't have a quorum because, of course, they have all bussed back. So it really was traumatizing. The learning from that was GLAD got more memberships in the next few hours than it had in years. And the Open and Affirming Ministries program became extraordinarily important in local congregations that thought all they had to do was kind of just relax. That the arc of justice is long, but bends, the arc of history bends towards justice. We learned, no, sometimes you gotta start bending it yourself. So I would say to our new generations and to those who are on the cutting edge, there is never a failure unless you let it be a failure. There's never a defeat unless you let it be a defeat. And then the final thing I just have to say that I think is common to all of us, and that is I get to be the poster boy. And I am well aware that I cannot do anything that I do if there weren't dozens, if not hundreds of people who made it possible for me to be on the front. People doing the hard day in and day out work. We have 2 of those people here. We've got Randy Palmer, who's been on the Alliance Council, who's been a treasurer, and we've got Mark Johnston, who is now our executive director of Open and Affirming Ministries for Alliance. But I could name, Steve Martz, who picked up the mail. I have a list of all these different people. Jackie Foster, who made these great connections with the African American and the social justice movement for Black Lives Matter. So we might be up here, but we know that there is a huge cloud of witnesses behind us. So, and I want to thank all those people who made that possible.
I'm Casey Lopata from the Catholic tradition. And there's been no formal church welcoming organization within the Catholic tradition. But there have been other efforts that have encouraged parishes to be more open and welcoming to LGBT persons. And I hope to give you a sense of some of these efforts by sharing my experience with some of them. Our son, Jim, came out to Mary Ellen and me in 1983. He was 19, the only gay person we knew. And we have much to be thankful for as we journey from the shock of that day to advocacy where we have been. We thank God for Sister Kay, a wonderful, wise, religious sister who Jim confided in, and she was our first guide. We thank God for PFLAG and all those other parents who helped dispel some of those myths that we somehow inhaled. We thank God for Rochester Dignity Integrity, where we got to know actually live gay and lesbian people and couples. And they had formed a model faith community. And we thank God for New Ways Ministry. Their resources guided us through the potholes of Catholic teaching. And surprise, we thank God for a 1976 U.S. Bishop's document which said, homosexuals have a right to respect, friendship, and justice. They should have an active role in the Christian community. Not bad. So, why wasn't there a formal Catholic Welcoming Parishes organization? Well, that same 76 U.S. Bishop's document, which sounded so welcoming, also condemned homosexual acts as intrinsically disordered and in no case can be approved. And that's the crux of the problem. Welcoming depends on whether those in authority favor a judgmental sexual ethic approach, or if they favor a pastoral approach that begins with the person as he or she or they is. Dignity got around this tension by forming safe space chapters. The chapters were not affiliated with parishes, though some parishes did let them use their facilities. New Ways Ministries workshops and resources provided practical ideas for how parishes could be more welcoming to LGBT people. And they were not affiliated with the parishes either. The Vatican moved toward the judgmental approach with Pope John Paul II, who came in 1978. And even more so in 1981 when Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger headed up the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. One example in that movement. In 1983, Seattle Bishop Raymond Hunthausen allowed Dignity to hold his convention mass at the cathedral. For this, and also for suggesting that prejudice against homosexuals was a greater evil than homosexual acts, he was punished by the Vatican. They gave an auxiliary bishop final authority on any matters dealing with sexual morality. The Vatican moved toward this judgmental approach, reached its peak with Cardinal Ratzinger's horrific 1986 letter. As expected, it said homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered, but it also added that the orientation itself, though not sin, was objectively disordered and self-indulgent. It also said any organization ambiguous or silent about such teaching could not meet in Catholic facilities, which of course led to the expulsion of most Dignity chapters from the parishes. And it also put in jeopardy anyone who did not believe everyone was or should be heterosexual. But Dignity and New Ways persisted. New Ways recognized that parents had considerable leverage in making parishes more welcoming and began hosting parent retreats in 1994. In 1997, New Ways published the first Catholic informal list of self-identified gay-friendly parishes, 33 of them at that time. The current list has over 275 parishes, so there's been progress. And the National Association of Catholic, Diocesan, Lesbian, and Gay Ministries was established in 1994 to work inside the church. They listed 17 dioceses and 72 parishes. And even some bishops found their voices. In a 1972 symposium, 3 of them spoke as panelists. One of them, Bishop Tom Dumbleton, told of his mother asking if her gay son, Dan, Tom's brother, would go to hell. And he replied, no, that is the way God made him, and God would make people a certain way that means inevitably they would be going to hell. A mother's simple question transformed a supportive but publicly silent bishop into a strong bishop advocate for LGBT Catholics. Parents do have leverage. That symposium was life-changing for us. 8 Rochesterians met late that night, of the last night of that, and vowed to not let that memorable experience simply be a warm memory. We went back and met. We became the Rochester 8, and ultimately the Rochester Gay and Lesbian Family Ministry in the diocese. And then later, understanding the niche that parents had, the important niche, Mary Ellen and I founded Fortunate Families, a ministry with and for Catholic parents. So there has been Catholic movement toward welcoming parishes, not a formal movement, but we've got a long way to go. But The good thing is, with the highly pastoral Pope Francis, we now have new energy.
Hi, Obie's going to take about 5 minutes for some clarifying questions, and then it's open for you to ask questions.
A couple of themes that have probably been apparent here, and that is that there was significant collaboration and cooperation between the various movements. Anne mentioned Open Hands magazine, which was formerly Methodist, but it served as a pan-denominational voice. And I also want to name some names. Mark Bowman, who is coordinator of this conference, was the first person to be the executive director of the Methodist Reconciling Ministries Network. Rosie also didn't take much credit, but the ONA movement within the UCC is different than the others. The others are all outsider organizations. They are all on the edge, they're on the periphery, they are goads in the side of the denominations, if you will. But ONA is different. ONA is actually an insider organization. It actually is an official part of the UCC. And the way that came about was in 1984-85, on Rosie's dinner table, they drafted a resolution that was first presented to the Massachusetts conference, which then went upstairs to the General Synod of the UCC and was passed. So since 1985, ONA has actually been a formal recognized ministry of the UCC. As the decade of the 80s wound down and we moved into the 90s, there were not many successes in terms of persuading the denominations to change their policies, these repressive policies that I mentioned that were enacted in the 70s. There were ecclesiastical trials that by and large were unsuccessful or successful if you were conservative and wanted to keep gays and lesbians out of ordained ministry and out of the churches. Legislatively, there was not much positive that came about in the 90s. And as a consequence, this welcoming congregations movement assumed even greater importance. As we can't change the denominations, it is so important that we do find enclaves, we do find safe sanctuaries here and there, and that they can band together. I should also mention Leo, and within our ELCA, the Reconciling in Christ was the name of our welcoming church movement, and the first congregation to sign up was Leo's St. Paul Reformation. So with that, we'll open it for questions.
Could I just make a comment, something that...
Get the mic.
Give me the mic, give me the mic. Thank you. Something that ran throughout all of our presentations, but was not necessarily spoken very clearly, is that we seem to be the example of the 100 monkey theory, those of you who know that. There was an island with monkeys on it, and one after another they learned to peel bananas, and suddenly all the monkeys knew how to peel bananas. We cross-potentiated one another. What was happening in each of your denominational groups cheered us on, and I hope that our efforts cheered you all on.
Raise your hand if you have a question, and if you'd like to say your name before you ask the question. Yes. Yeah, I will.
Mark Johnston with Open and Affirming Ministries, and I want to bounce off of what you just said, and I'd love to hear more about how the groups ended up working ecumenically, because sometimes it's been noticed that it's the gay folk in the church who have done more ecumenical work than anyone else. I know that the Welcoming Congregation program leaders and the Institute for Welcoming Resources have been very important to me in my work, and whatever you all might know about some of the birth of the beginnings of this being an ecumenical task.
I can say a little bit about that. In the beginning, we were all we had. And it didn't make much difference to us whether we were Catholic or Lutheran or Presbyterian or UCC or Baptist or Quaker. We were all we had. And I think that was a great strength because it taught us the importance of respecting one another and working together. Unfortunately, what I watched happen over the years was as each of our groups, and I'm talking specifically in the Twin Cities now in Minnesota, as each of our groups reached critical mass and had enough membership, then those denominational divides began to reappear, and I think that's something that we need to be ashamed of.
I know that it was a big commitment of Mark Bowman. As someone said, the Open Hands that started as Manna for the Journey became Open Hands, an ecumenical magazine, and he was very committed to getting all the voices, as he was basically the publisher, but he was committed to doing that ecumenical work. As I mentioned before, the books that I wrote were branded, literally, not for disciples, but for many of the other denominations, more light. I initially created them for Reconciling Ministries Network, but offered if people could, the other organizations could purchase pre-printing, I could put their contact info on the back and the front so that it looked like their material. There were also, as you said, the significant meetings going on of the leadership, some of which I attended, and training so that funders had a part to play in that because they were funding leadership training of the movement as well as the ecumenical, like the WOW conferences that were happening. When did that was in the early 90s?
2003.
Was it that recent? I would have said it was the 90s, but
yeah. And even though I don't think we branded it, I told Ann I bought boxes and boxes and boxes of that booklet, and every one of our open and affirming packets that went out had "And God Loves Each One." I also want to point out something we haven't talked about is that on a local level, there were a lot of ecumenical and interfaith LGBTQ groups, both in New York City where I served and in Cleveland, Ohio. Both of those had vibrant ecumenical and interfaith LGBTQ groups, and we learned best practices a lot. And I dare say, at least cities, I can't speak to rural places, that we met with each other because there was just this sense of we are all we had. We had to work together. And then the other thing I might note is we read. I can't tell you how many books of other Chris Glosser and you all just name again and again. We read about each other and we were inspired by each other and we'd read a little bit more. So.
In Rochester too, we had a group called the Interfaith Advocates for Gay and Lesbian People, which was started. Well, the first meeting was initiated by an Episcopal gay man, but after that, the two leaders were both allies, and it was also interfaith. So we had the Jewish synagogue represented as well. It was a wonderful organization.
Other question? Yes.
Can I use the microphone?
Yeah, use the mic.
I'm Bob Busson. I'm
out gay man, but also a Catholic priest from Utah. And I would like to affirm Casey and the very good work of Fortunate Families. But I'd also like to maybe talk about the other side of the unfortunate fence, which is the teaching church, whereas Casey represents the believing church, and they're not talking to each other. Just want to share a moment with you. This is a very difficult time, but as Casey well noted, an opening under Pope Francis. But I want to share a moment with you in my diocese in Utah. Most dioceses in the fall, the clergy gather with their bishop for a convocation for several days. At our convocation, we had one of the workshops was about welcoming, which brought me here today. We were all talking about, oh yeah, we're welcoming congregation, meaning that the priest stands at the door and greets the people after Mass. Usually greeters in the church that welcome you to come in and sit down and so forth. After that conversation, we were at tables, and from one of the tables, two of the priests stood up and said, "We need to talk about those who are not welcome in our Catholic churches." And very concisely and eloquently, they laid out a rather long list of people who were not welcome in the Catholic Church, including the gay and lesbian community. There was silence. And I want to come back to the silence, but afterwards, another table, two priests stood up and said, "We cannot compromise our Catholic beliefs in order to welcome people who are unrepentant." And I think that in a way speaks to the long journey we have to face into ahead of us. The other thing, though, is there is in the Catholic, I'll talk about the teaching side of the church, what I call the grand silence. We can't say the word gay to each other. We can't talk about outreach to gays in our community. And what it's done is just created this void, this emptiness, where there is no arena for the kind of conversations you all have enjoyed. And what the irony of all that is that the believing Catholic Church, that Casey speaks of, is not at all homophobic, is incredibly welcoming, is fully accepting of their sons and daughters, and wanting desperately for them to have a seat at our table. I just mention all that because at some point, again, the believing church has to listen to the teaching church that has finally begun to listen to the believing church. Thank you, Casey.
Thank you. Another question? Pardon.
I think that is an incredibly insightful distinction that you have made. I would like to add to that a third distinction, and that is the evangelical nature of the church. Unfortunately, I think what happens is we sit in our churches of various denominations being ready to welcome LGBT people and their families, but they have to find their way to us. And one of the things that we decided to do in our Wingspan ministry was not wait for that, and that we needed to be visible and make ourselves visible in as many ways as we could. We ran poster campaigns. We put posters on buses, which eventually led to the resolution that there would be no more posters of any kind on the buses. But in the meantime, we had our contract of 1 year. LGBT people in the broader LGBT community need to hear that we are welcoming. They need to see us more than just at our tent and pride festivals. And we need to figure out how to be evangelical in the best sense of that word. And so, with your permission, I would like to add that to your grateful distinction.
What I did, somehow I ran out of time with what I thought was a 6-minute conversation. But what I didn't talk about, I mean, this room represents who isn't welcome in the welcoming movement, and that is people of color and other nationalities. And it was after, I don't know, 30 years of working in the welcoming movement, there was some of those ecumenical trainings were with Beth Zemke, who was doing diversity training. And nothing was changing. It was just very, very white movement. So I ended up hooking up with Reverend Cedric Herman, who's a black minister, to create a black church movement for gay and transgender justice. And my experience of doing that, this was several years ago that it started. Like, first of all, everybody said, well, that's not going to happen. You know, like, people really had written off the black church. And, but my experience was that I had gone back 30 years. Like, what the context that I described of people being highly closeted, lots of condemnation from the pulpit, not everywhere, but it was pervasive enough. People not knowing that they knew gay people. I mean, it was all that stuff that we were dealing with in creating a black church movement. So the materials, what's been very moving to me is that Cedric and I, Reverend Herman and I, love to write together, so we created a black church version of the one, it's an enculturated black church version of the And God Loves Each One. We did that for Made in God's Image, and we created these very minimalist cards on huge topics like how to respond to negative claims about the Bible and LGBT. But what's moving to me is that every black Christian that I have had the privilege of handing one of these to, and they read it, what happens is that tears flow down because they've never seen themselves. That what they say is, I've never seen myself reflected in the LGBT materials, ever. So I hope that those of you who are being advocates will hook up with many voices and find, you know, like the denomination that I was part of, United Methodist, has a lot of black people, a lot of black churches, but they were never drawn to the reconciling movement because it was branded so white. Like, you couldn't see anything except white people in that thing, and there was, so while there have been notable black participation, like Dr. Pamela Lightsey, who's here, Reverend Yuzda Hardman Cromwell, who went way back. There has been black participation in the movement, but it's so visibly white that it really interferes with the success of those conversations. So I hope that you'll use the materials, the many voices as developed in your denominations and whatever the work you're doing in your community.
Getting people of color is a problem with parents as well. Our Fortune Families group, when we retired from the board in 2014, we had over 2,500 people on our mailing list, probably 650 parents. I only knew of one black parent that was on that list. And we talked about it. We just didn't know how to reach people of color. We did have some others, but not black African American parents.
Another question? Yes.
My name is Stephen Webster, he, his, him, and was a founder, one of the founders of the Methodist LGBT movement. But I wanted to say, when I was a student and a young person in Madison, Wisconsin, the Integrity Dignity chapter there was really very much ecumenical, still is. And I was a co-leader of that, as a Methodist, I was a co-leader of that group at a time, and we invited clergy of all denominations to lead Mass, and it was just, it still is, a very powerful organization in our local community, and I haven't, in the ecumenical gatherings that we've had, I don't think I've had the Catholic folks here, and it's really been good for me to hear their voices and their experiences here this weekend.
I'm curious, since you've all been activists, have you had any backlash? I mean, we're clergy, have people written you and how dare you or whatever? I'm curious, even among your early work, how other clergy people responded to you. I know there's a relief, not in my denomination, thank goodness, but I'm curious if you've had that, and if so, how have you reacted, and what's that dialogue been like?
I have a delightful story about sweating too much. After we had started the Wingspan ministry, there was considerable reaction to it both directions because it was so public and it was authorized by a Lutheran congregation, and so it was within the institution. Our senior pastor, Anita Hill, and I, who were colleagues at St. Paul Reformation at the time, were invited by a group of pastors who we knew were conservative for a conversation. The conversation is what we thought we were going to, it was not what they had in mind. We walked into this room, which is about the size of this room. There was an elevated stage on 3 sides of the room in which they all sat, and we sat on low chairs. And were asked basically to explain ourselves. And I don't know that I'm always as articulate as I would like to be, but I think the fact that the 3 of us sat there at least 36 inches lower than these pastors, all of whom looked like they knew Martin Luther personally, and did not blanch in the face of their condemnation, rocked them back on their heels because that was not what they were expecting. They really intended to bully us, and we did not let that happen, but I ruined a perfectly good shirt that day.
So yeah, there's 1,000 stories and some horrific ones and some funny ones. I won't go into those. What I think I'd like to say is now I'm in a position that's fascinating as a regional minister. And so I'm working with local congregations, and I've got some congregations that are becoming open and affirming. And then I've got congregations that left actually because I became the regional minister. One of the things that has irritated me, and I haven't figured out exactly how to respond, but in my position I think I really need to get this figured out, and that is that so often the radical religious right, conservative fundamentalist churches claim that the dying nature of at least Protestantism is due to us becoming more progressive, or us allowing progressive voices. I know, and I think we all know kind of instinctively, no, there's a big arc of Christianity that's changing. The nature of the church is changing beneath our feet, and there are 1,000 different factors in that. But I think we need to be able to be prepared to speak out when someone says, well, that's why the church is dying, because you're allowing homosexuality. And we need to be able to say, stop it. You and I know that's not true. That there's so many other societal and religious and really we might be at a place where the church as we know it needs to die. Certainly we've not been in the front edge of a whole lot of, the cutting edge of a whole lot of social justice issues. I happen to have a faith that says the Church of Jesus Christ will not just survive but thrive. But it needs to be in a way that we aren't in the way of that. But I would just encourage all of us, so when you hear it, because it's a narrative that is out there. I do remember, Rosie, one of the very first articles someone gave me when I started the Open and Affirming movement, I think I must have copied it 1,000 times, was Ann B. Day had done some study about, I think she'd even gotten a grant to do a study about open and affirming churches and stewardship. And in fact, what they found is those churches increased their stewardship. Magnificent. Did you want to say anything about that?
No.
Okay. Yeah. So I copied that because, the other storyline is when a church has integrity, loves its children in a way that the world sees, that's powerful. I mean, rather than a church that, is just so worried about making sure the pews have a plaque on them. So anyway, that's just what I'd like to say about the backlash, is I think sometimes the backlash, and we're living in an age of this kind of backlash, that once somebody in a back room gets that narrative and says, this is what will get us money, this is what will, we need to have a equally persuasive storyline the other direction.
I'm going to comment on that, but first I got to give you the preliminary, and this may take a little time here, but our diocesan ministry became official in September of 1996, Catholic Gay and Lesbian Family Ministry. March 1st of 1997, Bishop Matthew Clark, said a mass at the cathedral for gay and lesbian people, families, and friends. That was sort of a follow-up to the ministry becoming official. I predicted we'd have maybe 250 people attend. The church holds maybe 1,200. We had at least 1,300. We had 50 protesters marching out in front. We had a paddy wagon and police protection all around, including plainclothes cops inside. It was the most inspiring event I've ever been involved in. Not only in this ministry, I think just in general. Bishop Clark, actually before the Mass, he had a listening session with gay and lesbian people. He was a listener. He was wonderful. In his homily, he apologized to the gay and lesbian community. And it wasn't one of these, if we offended you in any way. It was an outright apology. Anyway, what I want to point out is the question was, is this going to hurt the diocesan appeal? There's a yearly appeal for all of parishes. We had more money donated that year than in the previous year.
Preach it.
Yeah.
Mr. Ann?
I'm distracted because I should have mentioned Randall Miller when I was cataloging that there were a few very prominent black participants in the reconciling movement. But to answer this question about pushback, my favorite story is in the, I don't have dates, but it was very early in Dumbarton's reconciling ministry. The bishop appointed a Chinese national minister who was experienced. He had done a lot of work in the sanctuary movement, as we had, but he walked in and made clear that he was totally theologically opposed to our stance on reconciling. So that was a major attempt to undermine our ministry. And what happened then, this must have been 1990, because Chip Aldridge and I started working on a declaration to treat holy unions the same way we do other sex marriage. And Chip did this brilliant write-up that was 2 pages of explanation about marriage and what it is and why we should treat everybody the same. And during that process, Manking Cho had been doing a membership class with new members, which included a lesbian couple that had grown up in the church and had, this amazing faith journey story. And by the time Manking Cho got through with them, he completely turned over and loved what we were doing. And in fact, when we took the statement to him that Chip and I had worked hard on, he said, the theological part of this isn't strong enough. And he worked really hard to strengthen that part. And then he said, so we have, this should be in the paper. So we sent it with a press release to the Washington Post, and one Sunday, it was on the front page of the Metro section of the Washington Post. This is like 1991, that this congregation, this United Methodist congregation. So Manking Cho had been a DS before coming to us, so I mean, it didn't occur to me that we needed to take care of the politics of this. So it's like, you would think he would have, but the bishop, that Sunday morning, the bishop was wakened by a call from somebody in the in the hinterlands of our conference. Do you see what one of your churches is doing? And he was outraged at us. So he brought us in for a meeting. Randall Miller was there, Chip Aldridge, myself, Mary Krause, who later was our minister, was the DS. She was the DS at the time in our income. District superintendent. So this one step down from bishop, and they had responsibility for a certain number of congregations. So we sat at this table where the bishop was just furious with us. And meanwhile, Manking Cho is sitting right next to him, inviting him into this new kingdom of God. It was like this guy that he sent to undermine us. And every now and then, Randall Miller, who was sitting across, you know Randall Miller, right? I mean, he did the prayer last night. Yeah. So every now and then, in his very deep voice, he would go, "Oh, Bishop, Bishop, Bishop." But I think that was the biggest backlash attempt at the ministry that we had. I had much more backlash when I was working at worship.
Backlash. Our ELCA denomination changed those repressive policies that I mentioned earlier in 2009. In a much contested National Assembly in Minneapolis, the policies made a 180-degree reversal from being exclusive to becoming inclusive and supportive, and there was a backlash. There were a lot of conservative preachers, there were a lot of conservative congregations within the ELCA that left. And as they left, they threatened to reconfigure North American Lutheranism. I think they really thought that they were simply going to take everyone, or that they were going to become the dominant Lutheran expression in North America. That has not happened. Certainly there were numbers, and if you just want to talk numbers, yes, there was a negative backlash to changing of policies, but the ELCA is stronger than ever. There is a bona fide spirit of moving forward into the future. Gay and lesbian candidates are routinely approved for ordination. We are holding marriage ceremonies in our largest congregations in the altar. I belong to a large congregation in downtown Minneapolis, and we frequently have interns and so on come through. And we have had a number of gay and lesbian interns come through. And what's interesting is not just are they receiving interest, but it's interest from small rural communities in Minnesota, which we would never have anticipated just 7 or 8 years ago. So yes, there are some numbers, but I think Alan spoke extremely eloquently to that numbers aren't all that there is. So yes, there has been a backlash in the ELCA to revise policies, but there is also a spirit of renewal and reconciliation and joy in moving forward.
Obie, did you hold up this book?
I didn't. Marty mentioned it. She said, have I had any backlash to writing this book about queer clergy? I wish there was a little more negative publicity about it.
No, because it's been marketed to progressive communities.
Thank you. Marnie, do we have 5 minutes?
No, yeah. Take her
Oh.
So while we've talked about pushback from those outside of the community, I'm actually thinking about how we often don't talk about the narrative within the community. And I guess what I'm basing this off of is when I go to a gay bar and I say I'm in the process to be ordained, I get this stone cold glazed face. And I've had guys just walk away, just not even say anything to me. And so while we're becoming welcoming to a community where they don't feel welcomed in our institutions. And so how have you all in your leadership navigated those things, or have you experienced them yourselves?
In the Lutheran Church, when I became involved with the Wingspan ministry, not only clergy wore collars, but ministry associates and seminarians and so forth. So I decided I would start wearing a collar. And I did that for 2 reasons. The first reason was that I popped up around the LGBT community in unexpected places where no one anticipated that somebody who clearly looked like they belonged to the church should ever show up, including bars. I didn't get very many people buying me drinks, but that wasn't the goal. The other part of that story is that there was considerable pushback on me wearing a collar because I was not ordained. And our bishop, who was very supportive at the time, dispatched one of his assistants to come and see me and talk to me about my collar. And he tried to convince me, after I told him why I wore a collar, that I needed to be a visible presence in the community, that maybe I could wear a little fish pin or something like that. And I said, nobody ever sees those things. And I'll tell you what, when the ELCA starts ordaining LGBT people, I will stop wearing my collar. And so they did, and so I have stopped. But that visible image is very important.
So Andrew, I have to give a personal story. When I was in seminary and actually on the dating circuit, I quickly learned I could say I was a social worker. Or I was in school for social work, which in my mind ministry is social work, because if I said I was going to be a minister, either I got that glazed look or I got, oh, I always wanted to ask a minister, and then they would come up with the craziest question that you can imagine. So that's how I personally dealt with it. So what I would suggest is I think that I don't think we've done such a good job of that. What I think the future holds is intersectionality. Is kind of 2 things: getting outside of our buildings and being in service in the world, in community. Because I think part of the problem is that all people see of Christians are what they see on TV. And maybe read, on the internet. But they have few interactions with Christians. And if their first interaction is always just as a Christian trying to talk to the LGBTQ community, I mean, that's kind of a cold call. But if they see these congregations out in the community marching for immigrant rights, standing up with their Black Lives Matter sisters and brothers and kinfolk. So for me, the future is intersectionality. Is a big, one of the things I always said when I was at a local church working on evangelism is if you go out there, expecting anybody, whether they're gay or not, to join your church, oftentimes they see that in your eyes. It's marketing. They're after me. But if you're genuinely out in the world doing service, what is the quote by Francis of Assisi? Preach the gospel always, and if you have to, use words. So for me, that's the way to make those connections, is to be in the world, doing the work of Christ, and then if they ask, you can say, yeah, I'm a gay Christian, I'm a lesbian Christian.
Just add to that, because I'm immersed in a project with Many Voices to create a blog series and a book on healing from religious trauma. And I think that's another level down of what actually that response has been. And we need to take it seriously, so.
Bill Oliver, I was hoping we'd also hear some of Peggy Campolo's journey.
Well, thank you. It wasn't that I wasn't invited to do that, but let me just tell you an American Baptist story about one of our greatest preachers, Dr. James Forbes, who for many years was pastor of the Riverside Church in New York City. I was on the Council of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists in the 80s, and we decided that we would really love to have him come preach to our held off to the side, not really accepted group that we had at the same time as the other Baptists met and didn't let us in. We had a table because the Baptist Peace Fellowship gave us half of their table every year, and the people in charge looked the other way. But anyway, it was really difficult getting to Dr. Forbes. He is a great speaker, and he had a wall of secretaries and people who protected him. But I was the lucky one that finally got to him, and he said of course he would come and preach. And it was in Providence, Rhode Island, and we had this beautiful church with the balcony around three sides. And the word got out that he was going to be there. And what I think I enjoyed most was watching, as the postlude played in the beginning of the service, these pastors who didn't want to be caught dead with us, but were dying to hear Dr. Forbes preach. They sneaked in and they filled the balcony, and I would do him a disservice if I tried to repeat his sermon, but it was wonderful, everything we had hoped for. And shortly after that, he was on a television show that I saw, and someone wanted to get into a big talk about this and asked him what he had to say. And he just said, well, God has many children, and some of them are straight. And indicated, and I have great admiration for him. He was the kind of preacher that could read the phone book and you'd listen. He's so good. Let's see. Do we have time for...
It's up to you now. I mean, you're close, but you can...
Okay. Well, I told Marnie this, and when I was in the main meeting and here today also, I was reminded rather sadly of a scene in the movie Gandhi, which probably most of you saw, and that was when the army was marching for their independence from Great Britain, and the film captured these waves of soldiers coming and getting mowed down by the stronger forces against them at first. And you saw the front couple of lines go down and you knew they had to be dead. And then people were horribly wounded, but they kept coming and kept coming. And India did get its freedom from Great Britain. And I think of what's going on that so many people have talked about here is like that. The people that came first, many of them who aren't even here, never got to have any of the joy of the victory that some of us are looking toward and feeling, probably rightly, that we had some part of it. But they really are the people whose shoulders we stand on. And thank you for coming. And thank you.